I'm Michael Allar, and today we're uploading Unreal Engine 4 to our Perforce server. Now, I'll be uploading a copy of Unreal Engine 4 that has been built from source code, but if you're only working with a project-only type of development structure, that's fine too. The majority of this video is about uploading engine source files in a way that makes it easy to work with, though. This video won't be about how to use Perforce exactly, but just how to get the structure in place so that rebuilding your engine isn't a nightmare. The first thing you want to do is open your Perforce connection and log into Perforce. The Add Files wizard will pop up. Go ahead and click Cancel. There's a lot of files in our Unreal 4 structure that we don't exactly need. This is because most of Unreal 4 gets automatically regenerated, and the files that should only be on Perforce are files that other team members absolutely need. Perforce also makes it so that any file you have not checked out is read-only. So if Visual Studio tries to overwrite that file, it'll have an error, and your build process gets really slow and annoying and frustrating. We'll be setting up those files so that they're overwritable without checking out. First thing we're going to need to do is, again, rebuild our project files, and then open up our Unreal 4 solution file. The first thing you want to do is you want to clean your solution by going to Build, Clean Solution. This ensures that any files that we don't need but are somehow built beforehand are deleted. We are going to rebuild our engine though, so once it's done cleaning, make sure you're set to your target platform for development, such as Win64, and make sure you're on Development Editor. And rebuild, you don't have to rebuild the UE4 core project. As long as you rebuild one of your projects, it'll rebuild this as well. So I want to rebuild example project. Now this will take us some time, either between 5 minutes or 45 minutes, depending on the speed of your system. So go ahead and pause this and come back when you're done. The UE4 editor has a bunch of programs behind the scenes that allow it to do things faster and in a more automated way. These are the programs that you see in a solution file here. Some of these programs are very helpful, so we should build the ones that we want. One of the main sets of programs to build is the automation set of programs. These help you cook builds and do other various tasks in UE4 editor pretty quickly. Because I only need Windows for my development platform right now, I'm just going to build the Windows automation project. You can build these later at any time if you decide to switch to other projects. I'm also going to build automation scripts.automation because that seems important. I will then build automation tool and automation tool launcher. Some of these are dependencies of another, so sometimes when you build one, you'll build the other, but I like building them individually just in case. I will then build crash report client because this opens up a box that usually tells you exactly where an error was, which is kind of helpful. The actual crash reporting bit, though, I don't really care for. I don't really deal with deployment, especially for small projects, so I'll skip deployment, but I will build Distill. After building Distill, then I'll build .NET Utilities, which again should already be built because you built Distill, but it's nice to build it anyway. I'm not building for the iPhone, so I'll skip the iPhone packager, but I will build many dump diagnostics. I generally don't use Slate Viewer, so I'm going to skip that. Well, I'm also going to build Shader Compile Worker. It's important you build Shader Compile Worker because it builds shaders. I'm also going to build Symbol Debugger because I like debugging symbols, but you might not need this. Again, you can always rebuild any programs that you need later. I'll then build UE4 editor services. Now I'm going to skip the Unreal build tool because this gets rebuilt every time you rebuild your project anyway, so this will always be current. I'm going to skip Unreal File Server as well, but if you're building to mobile devices and want to host files off your computer, you should build Unreal File Server. I'm going to build Unreal Frontend because it's pretty handy in terms of cooking builds, and it kind of automates a lot of the boring command line batch process stuff. I will skip Unreal Launch Daemon, but if you're using any type of Unreal 4 editor feature that allows for remote launching of Unreal projects such as mobile testing or anything like that, you would want to build that. You should always build Unreal Lightmass because it builds lighting for levels, and that's pretty important. I just realized I skipped Unreal Header Tool. Unreal Header Tool is like Unreal Build Tool, in which it will always be built whenever you build anything, so you can go ahead and skip that. Unreal Pack is for creating single big pack files for cook builds. Generally I don't use pack files, but I tend to build it just in case I want to cook with them, but it's not too important either way. And I skip Unreal Sync as that's a tool for downloading Unreal from Perforce, which isn't needed because you're not going to ever be downloading from Epic's Perforce repo. And then I will build Unreal version selector just so that if for any reason I have multiple copies of Unreal 4 being built from source code, at least this copy of Unreal 4 can set up the current registry files and all that nonsense in order to keep your projects running in the right version of Unreal. Now that we have all our stuff built, we need to make sure the editor runs. So open up my example project, and you can open your editor however you want, but if you are following the tutorial series, you'll already have batch files for that stuff right here. And I'm going to hit play in editor, and it seems to not crash, so I think the engine's pretty good. It should be stable. You can do more testing if you want, but at this point you can go ahead and close the editor. Now we can clean up some files to keep our upload even smaller and leaner than just uploading straight. First thing you want to do is you want to go to your engine folder, and you go to your binaries folder. Now, I've already cleaned my platform folders, but you'll see things like Linux and iOS and HTML5. For any platform that you're not currently developing on, go ahead and delete those folders. Now, if you're developing for Win64, I recommend keeping the Win32 folder because this debug help.dll sometimes comes in handy. You should never delete third-party or .NET. These should always be there. If you're building for iOS, you can keep it there too, but if your main development is Windows, you can always add platforms back in later. I'll go back up to the engine folder, and now we're going to start deleting things that we don't need. One thing we can delete is the DerivedDataCache folder. This gets regenerated every time you load engine content, so there's no point in having it on Perforce. You should also have a documentation folder that I've already deleted, and you can keep the documentation folder if you'd like, but the documentation is available online, so I don't really see a point, because I very rarely work offline. I like to keep the extras folder just in case there's any scripts or anything any team member needs. That way we don't have to go look for it, because these things aren't easily findable online unless you have the GitHub access. Then I will delete the intermediate files. These are all the files that Visual Studio makes when building your project, and they can add a lot of file size and a lot of time to your Perforce uploads, even though they're going to be regenerated every time you build your project. Now there are binaries built in the plugins folder that we don't necessarily need. These are the intermediate and debug files that, although should be, I believe, in the intermediate folder in the engine folder, these are somehow kept locally to the plugin folder. So the easiest way to delete these is to search for any OBJ files. You can do this in Windows by just typing OBJ. If you don't have any, that's great. Next thing you want to search for is PDB, and then I have some PDB files, so I'm going to delete all of these. You should have some OBJ files. Go ahead and delete them too, like I did with these PDB files. Now, if you have any shipping binaries, which you shouldn't if you clean your solution correctly, then I would delete those too. But I don't have any, so I can't show that. The programs folder is usually safe to upload as is. There's some user-generated stuff in here, but that kind of speeds things up, and you don't really need to do much here. There's no point in cleaning up for the programs folder. But you do want to delete the saved folder immediately after that. This is where, when you load up the engine, a bunch of your config files get regenerated and recached in certain ways, and things like autosaves and log files. You don't want those on your Perforce, so go ahead and delete these. Shaders, very important that we keep that, and source code. All of the source files in source are generally useful, so we're going to keep that completely intact. With the engine folder now clean, or relatively clean, I want to double check the binaries folder and the Win64 platform, because I built for this platform. I want to scroll down and look for anything that says shipping or debug in the file name itself, because we only want the development editor. We don't want any shipping binaries. I don't have any, but if you see any shipping files or release files, go ahead and delete those. Next thing I want to delete are all the Unreal 4 editor PDB files. So the easiest way to do that is to sort by type and scroll down and find all the PDB files. It'll be program debug database files. And I like to generally keep most of this shader compiler worker and all these other PDBs on board because they tend to be needed for some things. But I will delete Crash Report Client PDB and Mini Dump Diagnostics PDB because they are pretty huge. Now for the rest, or I will delete symbol debugger because this will be rebuilt and that's huge. And for UE4 editor, the rest of these UE4 editor files, I will delete all of these because again, these will be rebuilt, and anyone who sends you a dump file can rely on your PDB files instead of having to download it themselves. I also do the same with the Unreal Header Tool files and the Unreal Lightmask PDB files. If you built Unreal Pack, we'll delete Unreal Pack and the Unreal Version Selector PDB as well, because they're just huge and they're not really used very often, and if you ever need them, you can always rebuild. Binaries folder I think is considered clean, unless you have the optional pack installed, which if you follow my tutorials you do, then you'll have these other platforms that might have files with PDB files in them as well. For example, the HTML5 platform. Now this, you might not necessarily need these files, but if you have the optional download from the GitHub installed, you're going to be rebuilding these files no matter what anyway, so might as well just keep them on Perforce, but just delete the PDB files. And then the same with iOS. Just going to delete all these PDB files because they are significantly big and will always be rebuilt. Linux the same way. Make sure you delete just the PDB files. Cool. Now we can clean our project files. My project is named Example Project. I'm going to go directly right into the Binaries Win64 platform, and I'm going to delete all the files just named Example Project, and I want to delete the PDB file. The reason for this is that currently in this stage of development, we're still developing the game. We don't necessarily need the standalone binary on Perforce. You can always rebuild and put that up later, but for now we're just going to be using the editor, so might as well only keep editor files. And we don't need a PDB file because again those will be rebuilt. Back in the example project folder, or whatever your project folder is named, you'll see that you also have the DerivedDataCache files and their intermediate file and the saved folder, so go ahead and delete those files and folders too. Next you'll see the example project SDF, SLN, uproject, and v12.uco files. Go ahead and delete the Visual Studio files, but do not delete the .uproject file. That's important for your project. Just delete the Visual Studio files. The reason for this is the Visual Studio files can always be regenerated with the generate project files command in the root. Back in the root, go ahead and close Visual Studio. That way we can delete the Visual Studio files located here too. It should be UE4.sdf, UE4.sln, and UE4.v12.suo, because these get pretty big. The SDF file in this case is already 300 megabytes. With all that cleaned out of the way, we're now able to upload everything to Perforce. There's a much cleaner, much more lightweight version of Unreal 4 that we can keep on Perforce, and anything else that we don't have on Perforce will always be able to be regenerated or re-put back in at a later time if we need. It is important that you don't open the editor right now, because then you'll have to go back and re-delete the DerivedDataCache and saved folders. If you did everything right, what we should be able to do is right-click our depot root here and hit mark for add. This might take a while because it's going to add a lot of files to your pending change list in Perforce. All of my files have been now marked for add, so my depot folder is 8.31 gigs. So after we're done marked everything for add, we're going to have to upload about 8 gigs of stuff to the Perforce server. Now if we did not delete those PDB files, this folder can be upwards of around 40 to 60 gigs, which is a lot of space for a lot of stuff that can be regenerated. If your internet connection is not stable enough to upload 8 gigs in one go, you can always submit things folder by folder. I recommend doing the engine binaries folder as one submit, and then the content as one submit, and then the rest of the engine folder as one submit, and then your project, and then the samples, and the templates. And the sample folder is pretty lightweight, so it's not too big. And the templates, if you really want to save some extra space, you can delete the templates folder. It's only 200 megs, but these samples and templates folder aren't actually necessary, but they are useful. I'm going to go ahead and submit everything with the change list description of initial commit and hit submit. At this point, I'm going to skip ahead to when it's done. My submit has about 33,422 files. Yours might be plus or minus a bit of files depending on how much you deleted and what platforms you're building for. Now that your change list has been submitted in Perforce, if you go to the History tab by clicking the little clock looking button here, you should see your initial commit up. Or if you did several commits, you should see several commits. Now let's run the project just to make sure it runs. It should run. We tested it before we committed, but you should always just on the initial commit make sure everything's still good. Now we deleted the DerivedDataCache, so it's going to have to compile shaders again, which might take a while. The editor still opens, and even though I have to compile all the shaders again, it is running. Hit play, and everything's still working, just without shaders, and now they're being loaded in. At this point, we need to set up Perforce so that our binary files are writable. If you were to build a project again, and like change some code and recompile, you'll get some errors. Let's go through those errors now and see what happens. First step is to generate project files again. And when you do that, you'll see there are a bunch of errors. And that's not really cool. So the problem with this is that the Unreal Build Tool program folder has a bunch of development files in there that are read-only, and they're not being accessible by the generator. So in order to get those accessible, we need to change some write permissions on some of these files, or just delete them, depending on what the files are. Turns out there's quite a bit of intermediate files, so we will in fact have to clean up our source folder just a little bit. First thing to do is go into Engine Source Programs, and we need to go ahead and delete all the OBJ folders. Now there are quite a few programs here that the OBJ folder will cause quite some issue with. So the easiest way to handle all this is to go back into the Engine Source folder and go to Programs, and then in here what you want to search for is any folder that contains the name OBJ. In my version of Windows, which is a variant of Windows 8, you can just search for name, colon, and then OBJ. With that, you have all these folders that say OBJ and some other files here, but don't worry about those files. Just select all these folders that are just strictly OBJ and delete them all. Now, this will get rid of all the intermediate files off of your local copy, but Perforce won't recognize you've done this until you've done a reconcile all files in your programs folder. Meaning, if you right-click Programs and hit Reconcile Offline Work, you'll get a box that pops up saying, hey, these are all the files that are on Perforce, but you just deleted them. And we should just be fine and just hit Reconcile after this, and it'll delete all these files. With that done, let's generate project files and see if there are more errors. And as you definitely should get another error. There's a bunch of binary files now that are locked because they've been submitted to Perforce, but we're trying to rewrite binary files right now, which is sort of the problem with Unreal and Perforce on your first setup. To remedy this, we go to our Engine Binaries Win64 folder. We don't want to delete all these binaries because they're needed by the team, but you do need to make them writable locally. The best way to make all these binaries writable is to, in Perforce, in your workspace view, sort by type. Not file type, but specifically type. And what this will happen is this will list everything in here by file extension. We want all exes to be writable. Now, I just see here that I have Unreal Version Selector shipping in here. I missed this on my first cleanup, so I'm going to go ahead and right-click this and mark for delete because I don't need a shipping binary anymore. Okay, I'll take all these exe files, these executable files, right-click, go Change File Type. Then I will change the file type to always writable in workspace. I'll add this to the default change list. This makes it so even if they're not checked out, they're rewritable. This way we can test builds and do things without having to worry about checking out certain files over and over again. This might seem a little odd, but when you have multiple people trying to recompile the editor for small code changes, you can't have the editor locked out to one person. Both programmers are going to need access to this file. And we're going to do the same thing with all these DLL files. And there is a large number of DLL files. Oh, here we go. Here's the DLL files. Take all these DLL files and make them writable in the workspace so that Visual Studio can just build without worrying. Now you'll see some PDB files you may have left over. You know, I prefer having these in here because I'm a little crazy, but if you decide you don't need any PDB files, you can go ahead and select all these all and hit mark for delete. Be careful to not accidentally delete the simserve.yes file, because it's easy to select that if you're selecting lots of stuff. Now this isn't the only place for exes and DLLs. If you have other platforms, you're going to need to set all these other binaries to writable as well. This could be a little time consuming, but doing it all now means you don't have to do it later. You don't usually have to set writable on debug help.dll. This doesn't usually get rewritten. And third party is usually fine. These don't usually get rebuilt, so you can leave it as is. .NET though, some of this stuff does get rebuilt. So again, just set writable to all the exes, all the DLLs, and in this folder, set them to the config folder, config files as well, because they tend to get rewritten all the time. Now before, we did not clean up PDB files in this folder, and generally you don't need to, but you should delete the Unreal Build Tool.pdb just so that Visual Studio won't freak out when you keep running the Unreal Build Tool. So I'm going to go ahead and select the Unreal Build Tool.pdb and hit mark for delete. Cool. If you built the automation tools, it's nice to do that as well. Same with the distill.pdb. Now if you ever get any .NET utility build issues regarding the PDB, go ahead and delete it, but I usually leave this in there because sometimes without this file things kind of weird happen, and I'm not sure exactly why, but it's nice to keep that in there. Now with iOS, if you're using iOS, you can make these writable and stuff, but these generally aren't built by you and will never be messed with if you're not building for iOS. Here are automation scripts. Again, set the DLLs to writable. And these PDBs you can safely delete. And you want to do this for all the platforms that you're going to be building for. Could have did some better selection there, but once that's done, and your binary files are now writable, you should be able to rebuild those files now. So let's go ahead and generate project files and see if there's any more errors. And it looks like there are no errors at all, which means all our files that need to be writable are currently writable, at least enough to rebuild our project files. Let's go ahead and open up our Unreal 4 solution now. To make sure that we can rebuild everything, let's just go ahead and rebuild our project that we're working on now. And this will have to be a full rebuild because we deleted our intermediate files before our Perforce upload. And on build, you should get a fatal error and it cannot open some sort of binary. For me, in this case, it's the Unreal Header Script Generator plugin. So it turns out there are a bunch of DLL files in our engine plugins folder because these binaries aren't pushed to engine binaries. They're for some reason stuck in the engine plugins folder. So now we have the tedious task of going to each of these plugins and making sure that our DLL plugin or our DLL upload is set to writable. And you could write a batch file for this, but I tend to just do it manually because you only need to do it once. And I won't record every step, but the idea is that for every folder in the plugins folder, there's a subfolder, and in that folder there's a binaries folder, and in that folder is a platform folder, and in that folder is a DLL that you need to change file type to writable. There might be multiple DLLs, and there's any PDB files, you can go ahead and delete those as well, but make sure all DLL files are writable. Again, a little tedious, and there might be ways to automate it, but once it's done, it's done. I managed to accidentally make a new change file type. I went ahead and moved all my checked out files to my default, and I'm just going to delete this pending change list because there's no files in it. That's said, now let's go back to Visual Studio and rebuild our project. Hopefully we didn't miss any. If during your build you get a failed to save backup for and a bunch of configs files, the way to fix that is to go to Engine, Programs, Unreal Header Tool, and then even though usually it's okay to submit all this, if you this usually doesn't really affect anything, but if you'd like to get rid of that warning, go ahead and open up Unreal Header Tool and just mark for delete the saved folder in the Unreal Header Tool program. If you want to get rid of those warnings when you build shaders later as well, you can open up the shader compile worker and mark for delete the saved folder in this shader compile worker program as well. Now with this build, I have another issue in that it can't produce an example project, or on yours it should say whatever the name of your project is. It can't produce a file within a folder. So even though we squared away all the engine binaries, we need to set up our project binaries. So you go to your project folder, you go to binaries, and just like we do with everything else, just select all your project binaries for all your platforms and make them writable. And doing that, if we rebuild our project, it should be significantly faster now because most of the engine is built. It should only just have to link your project file. And there it is. Project file has now been linked, one succeeded, one up to date, and the one up to date project, that is the core UE4 project. With that, let's go ahead and make sure our editor is working again. Let's go ahead and open our depot, fire up our editor. The editor should load relatively quick because it doesn't have to compile shaders or anything. Those are already generated for you for your local client. If we play an editor, we'll see that everything still works and that our build is good. So let's close this and let's submit all the changes to our binary file types by just submitting our change list. And submit. And this can take a while depending on your speed, but this really shouldn't take too long. Most of these binaries are actually pretty small. Now that we're submitted, let's again, just to be sure, run our editor, which is in our root. And everything still seems to be working. Hooray! So instead of closing the editor this time, what we're going to do is we're going to configure Unreal to use Perforce for all its content files. In Unreal 4, on the top right of the editor, you'll see a red circle with the slash through it. If you click that, we get the source control login box. You go ahead and click the provider, go ahead and click Perforce. Now, if your Perforce environment settings are set up, meaning that in Perforce, if you go to Connection, Environment Settings, and then hit OK, here you just type in the server host name, your username, and for workspace, you can leave this blank and select your workspace from the available workspaces drop-down. If you don't see your workspace in this box, you're probably not connected for one reason or another, and should check the source control log to see if anything pops up as to why. You will not need to enter your password, but you do have to log in with Perforce at some point before opening Unreal. As long as you're logged into Perforce with your P4 client, Unreal will be able to connect to your Perforce using these settings alone. Just hit Accept Settings, and the top right red icon should turn into a green circle with two little black arrows. What this means is you don't have to go into the Perforce client to do anything content related in Unreal anymore. Say if you want to import a new texture or to resave a texture or something like that, you can go ahead and right click a texture and either hit checkout or just hit save. If you hit save and you don't have it checked out, it'll ask if you would like to check it out. and you can check it out. And then at this point, if you want to check out a map or anything like that, really the easiest option is just to hit save. If I hit save, it'll ask if I want to check out this map, and hit checkout selected. It'll check it out. And when I want to submit everything to Perforce, I can just go to File, Submit to Source Control. It'll look for everything that I changed, and I can type in a change list such as sample commit, hit OK, and it will go ahead and submit these files into source control. And if I go to my Perforce client and go to history, you'll see that it is in fact submitted. Now the problem with Unreal in Perforce is that you cannot update items from the server while the editor is running. Bad things tend to happen pretty quickly. However, if someone has another item checked out, you can see the status of it, or that you can see that you're out of date, but you cannot update while the editor is running. So to update, always close the editor. Make sure the editor is closed, otherwise you'll get an error that says unable to write file 10 times or something similar to that. Click your root and click get latest revision, and then you'll get the updates from all your team. And that is Unreal on Perforce. Woo!